Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. This is John Denuzzo, the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. Our guest again is Dr. Richard Leach, who visited us last month and gave us a lot of information about smallpox and its effects on the Continental troops and certainly even during the French and Indian War. Dr. Leach, welcome back.
Thanks. Again, happy to be here.
Oh, thanks for coming. Now, we're focusing in this podcast about the father of our country, George Washington, and the serious personal medical conditions that he faced throughout his life. Did his health issues stem all the way back to childhood?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, he had a lot of sore throats when he was a youngster, but didn't sound too out of the ordinary. But then when he was 15, he had what was almost certainly diphtheria, which in those days had a high mortality rate, anywhere between 10 and 20%. So that was really the first of his potentially mortal diseases that he suffered during his life. At 17, he started his first bout of malaria, and he had several bouts of malaria during his entire life. He never was seriously ill, but again, that was another potentially mortal disease. And then when he was 19, he had a combination of both tuberculosis and smallpox at the same time. I mean, both of those are killers. And how in the world could he have survived that? I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable, but he did.
Well, he must have had an iron constitution, as they say, ironically. Yeah. Now, he had a history, a very important part in the French and Indian War, which isn't all to the positive, but certainly as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces in the Revolution, he played an important role, and he bore tremendous burdens during the war. From your research, have you discovered anything that indicated his military duties drained his health or his health that affected his leadership?
Interesting questions. To the first one, it's pretty easy to say, yes, indeed. I think that the military duties did subject him to significant health problems. Most special of those was dysentery, because he had recurrent bouts of dysentery, which is bloody diarrhea. And, of course, we don't know exactly what the germ was in those days. It was probably bacterial, could have been parasitic, could have been a mixture of both, who knows. But anyway, he was often confined to his, not bed, but cot in the army camps of those days, and pretty darn sick. There's that great story about him in the French and Indian War when he was General Braddock's second in command in, 1755, I think it was. He was badly sick for 2 weeks, like I say, in a cot, being hauled in a wagon behind the troops as Braddock came toward Fort Duquesne, where the Monongahela River, where Pittsburgh is now. They were, going to besiege it and so forth and so on. Braddock was significantly ahead of him, got ambushed, was being whacked pretty badly. Washington had to get up out of his bed. His bottom was real sore from his dysentery. He put a pillow on his saddle, caught up with Braddock just in time for Braddock to be mortally wounded, and then Washington himself, sitting in the saddle for at least 12 hours in a stretch on that pillow. He had 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 musket balls going through his coat, and he was untouched. But boy, I'm sure his bottom was sore in heck.
Oh, yeah, I'll bet it was. He was always yearning to return to Mount Vernon, in the Continental Army when he was president. Did Mount Vernon have that kind of environmental effect on him that he really, his health improved there? Or is it just a yearning that was kind of natural to be back home with the wife?
Well, I haven't read his journals because they're almost impossible to read. It was before Noah Webster regularized the American language, and so they're difficult. But apparently they're full of nostalgia for Mount Vernon and for Martha and his whole family life there. And he was prone to depression, interestingly enough. And I think that part of that was his illnesses when he would get this dysentery and be wiped out and stuff like that. But honestly, I think he was very nostalgic, always for Mount Vernon. That's what he really loved to do. And as soon as the war was over, he hightailed it right back to Mount Vernon and when he could have been king.
Ah, yes. Now, the fact that George Washington had no children of his own, he adopted Martha's when he married her as she was a widow. Did that have anything to do with the illnesses he had had up to that point?
You mean contagion among his family? Or?
No, I mean, was he sterile?
Yes, he was sterile. Yes, yeah, he was sterile because of smallpox. Well, we think, we surmise. So that was one of the ramifications of smallpox, was sterility. And blindness was another one. And, of course, he always bore the marks of smallpox on his face because he was heavily scarred.
Mm. I seem to remember something also that he was in the Caribbean at some point. Was that one of his illnesses as well?
Yeah, it was Barbados. What actually happened when he was 19, I think it was, his brother, whose name I think was Lawrence, who was an older brother, contracted tuberculosis. And in the thought of the day, the idea was to get him to some other place where maybe it would be better for his tuberculosis. So George took him to Barbados.
George took him?
George took Lawrence, his brother.
How old was George, do you know?
George was 19 at the time.
Oh, okay.
And I think Lawrence was 24-ish. By the way, Lawrence subsequently died. Without doubt, because of the intimacy of their contact, George picked up tuberculosis. And there's some record of his having had, chest disease. And that was also when he got smallpox in Barbados. So again, he had tuberculosis and smallpox both at the same time. And there he was, 6'2" and an incredible hunk of a guy. He worked out every day. He rode something like a couple of hours straight most every day of his life. And he was notoriously strong. He was always called upon to do the really tasks of strength in his life. And he stood ramrod straight, And by the way, he was a terrific dancer, especially of the minuet.
Well, I remember I've read at several points that he was the kind of guy that you would look at in a room and immediately say, he's the guy in charge. He just had that charisma or whatever he had, the way he carried himself. Yeah. Now, he lived through extremely harsh combat conditions through 2 terms as our first president of the United States. He died at the age of 67 at his Mount Vernon home. What can you tell us about his death?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you something about that. First, to underline what you said, yes, he died at age 67. The average age of death in those days was about 32. So he way outlived the normalcy, and I don't know how he did that with all these darn diseases that he continued to have. Well, he was actually quite healthy when he retired from the presidency. He, again, skedaddled back to Mount Vernon as quick as he could get out of Washington or wherever he was at the time, turning things over to John Adams. And he rode just as he had always had his state every day, overseeing what was going on and so forth and so on. And one December morning, he was caught out in a sleeting, rain, snowy kind of day. He had a hard time getting home because of the storm. He was therefore late for dinner, and he was notoriously punctual, and he couldn't stand to not be punctual. So he actually went to dinner remaining in his wet and cold clothes. Then he went to bed, and the next morning he woke up with this bad sore throat and being unable to breathe. What we surmise from looking at the records, the inflammation of that a disease either called epiglottitis, which is inflammation of that flap that's down in the bottom of our throats, or he had something called quinsy, which is a big abscess in the back of his tonsils that was impinging on his airway, and he couldn't move air through there. He could breathe a little bit better when he could get up. Well, they called in, 3 physicians that same day. The physicians, did all these things to him. They gave him enemas. They put on Spanish fly, a blistering agent on his throat, which literally blistered his flesh. The idea was to draw the evil humors out of the illness. And, of course, none of that stuff worked. Then they decided to bleed him. And so they bled him a total of 4 times. Each time he didn't get any better. In fact, of course, he was getting worse. And they said, I guess we didn't bleed him enough. In the end, they think, by the records, that at least 2 liters of blood were taken out, which is about 35 to 40% of all of his blood. And, of course, he died later that day. And, the question is, well, did the doctors kill him? Well, he probably would have died from his throat anyway, honestly. So I can't really say that the doctors did him in. But, here's an interesting final fact. He was such a gentleman, and he was gasping for breath. But as he was dying, and he knew he was spiraling down without doubt, and in terrible discomfort, of course, he thanked every one of the people in his room for attending him at the time. I mean, he was a gentleman right to the end, and, in my view, perhaps our greatest founding father.
Wow. Well, that's a terrific way to end the story of George Washington. He was pretty innovative, too. I remember you told us the last time about how he instituted variolation among the Continental troops and probably saved the Army, or at least thousands of lives by doing that. So Dr. Richard Leach, again, it's been a pleasure to have you. We appreciate you coming on. Our website is lakegeorgebattlefield.org. Any final words?
Well, I've really enjoyed being with you. Thank you.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.